right, moving right along to story number 2. Last week, I talked about a story that was published on Slate, and it was all about how a bird species native to the Great Plains, McCowan's longspur, it has to be renamed, darn it, because the man who discovered that species of bird in 1851, John Porter McCowan, 10 years after he discovered it, joined the Confederacy and became a general. And, of course, as we all know, any single mistake that any single one of us makes is grounds for immediate cancellation. There is no forgiveness, there is no understanding, there is no mercy, there is no anything. Immediate damnation. Memoriam damnatio. I believe that's the correct Latin. Well, this week we have another piece from Slate. This time from a woman named Brooke Newman, who is an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University. And after reading this piece and reading her brief bio where it says that she is an associate professor of history, it makes much more sense now, because a historian, an ideological historian, is the only one who could have been brain dead enough to actually write something like this. Professor Newman's piece in Slate is all about how the time has come for the royal family to make amends for all of the advantages and all of the profits that it made through slavery. Okay, the title of her piece, I don't know if she thought of this or if the editors over at Slate thought of this, I don't know, but the title of the piece is Throne of Blood. That is the thesis of her piece. So, Newman lists the British slave trade, which started in 1560 under Elizabeth I, and she talks about the colonization under the Stuarts and in the 18th century into Africa via the company of royal adventurers into Africa. That's really the gist of her piece, starting with the creation of the slave trade in Britain in 1560 all the way through the 18th century when you had colonization, imperialism, etc., etc., etc. She even says, the British guineas, if you watch old movies or if you watch Mystery Channel, Poirot, Sherlock, the Granada version of Sherlock Holmes, all those really great, good shows, Inspector Morse, Midsummer Mystery, things like that. You've probably heard them talk about or mention guineas. Well, Newman talks about that. That's just another example of British imperialism and racism, because guineas only came after the expansion of British influence into Africa. They were originally made out of gold, and the markings on it had the king's head over an elephant, which, according to Newman, was a symbol that the king had successfully expanded England's interests in Africa. So obviously the guinea is racist too, and that needs to go the way of the dodo. Now, I can't read all the pieces, but that's basically it. From Elizabeth up through the 18th century, the British royal family, she consistently says that. Remember that here. This is going to be important later on. The British royal family supported slavery and expanded on it, as well as colonialism and imperialism. And this is how Newman ends her piece. Quote, officially acknowledging that the royal family both fostered and profited from the enslavement of millions, and affirming a commitment to reparatory justice as the Caribbean community has urged the governments of Britain and Europe to do, is the very least the present-day British monarchy owes to the descendants of enslaved people. The Crown's act of willful forgetting demonstrates how easy it was to overlook, then and now, the pivotal role played by the royal family in accelerating England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and the development of an Atlantic empire built on the backs and blood of African and indigenous people, unquote. Oh, in the first place, Professor Brooke Newman of Virginia Commonwealth University, she's a pretty poor historian. I told you just a second ago to make note of the fact that throughout the piece, she talks about the royal family, the monarchy. Problem is, the royal family of Britain is not a continuous monolithic entity. There have been multiple royal families throughout British history, okay? I can't name them all. British history is not exactly my forte, but I do know that there have been I'm never going to pronounce this word correctly, the Plantagenets from the Middle Ages. There were the Tudors, there were the Stuarts, there were the Hanovers, there were also the Windsors. In fact, the Windsors are the royal family that is in power at this moment as I speak. Queen Elizabeth II is of the House of Windsor. But here's the interesting thing. The House of Windsor only came to the throne in 1917. The British Empire abolished slavery in 1833. So I would be very interested to hear Professor Newman explain how the current royal family of Great Britain, how it could actually have profited from slavery when it only ascended the throne almost 100 years after the British Empire abolished slavery. And that actually leads me to the second point. It was the royal family, specifically it was the Hanovers, that abolished slavery, like I said, in 1833 through the Slavery Abolition Act. Now, it is true that there were some exceptions made for the East India Trading Company, Ceylon, and the island of St. Helena. But those exemptions were actually abolished later, 10 years later, in 1843. So by 1843, the British Empire has abolished slavery, and it has abolished the slave trade. Now keep in mind, 1843, we're not quite at the halfway point of the 19th century, but already at this point, the sun never sets on the British Empire because it has the British Isles, duh. It still has its spheres of influence in Africa, in China, in the Middle East. It still actually rules India at this point. The monarch is known as the King of Great Britain and the Emperor of India, or in the case of Victoria, the Queen of Great Britain and the Empress of India. So the British Empire expands the globe. And by abolishing slavery completely in 1843, slavery and the slave trade, the British Empire abolished slavery in a large part of the world. The first time that had ever happened. Again, slavery has been around as a practice, as hideous as it is, has been around since practically the very beginning of human history. And the British Empire made great strides in actually abolishing it throughout the world. Furthermore, it went further than that. It instructed the Royal Navy to hunt down slave ships and slavers and to treat them as they would pirates. Okay, that is pretty serious. If you're treated as a pirate, you know, the scum of the sea almost, in the eyes of law and order, that's pretty big. So even when you're not a pirate, but you're treated as a pirate because you're the next worst thing, which is a slaver, or you run a slave ship, you're on a slave ship, that sends a pretty strong message. And the British Empire was one of the only places to actually do that. Okay, the Ottoman Empire, to give just a piece of contrast, didn't officially abolish slavery until the 1920s, until the 20th century. Heck, Saudi Arabia didn't officially abolish slavery until the 60s. Slavery has only been officially illegal in Saudi Arabia for 50 years. That is what's happened. And it's actually rather funny. All of this is hilarious because I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember that one of the talking points of the left used to be during the 90s and in the early thousands, it was that America needed to be more like Europe. Oh, we needed to be more like France, more like Germany, more like these Nordic countries, like Sweden. And it was actually, as part and parcel of that talking point. It was often brought up that, the British Empire, they had abolished slavery way before America had. Look at that, they got rid of slavery in 1833. It took America until 1865 to get rid of slavery. It took America another 32 years to get rid of slavery. And now all that isn't worth a hill of beans. It's not worth a hill of beans because the narrative has moved on, and what was uber progressive yesterday is now just another example of your white supremacy and your white fragility. The main message of Newman's piece here at Slate is that, again, the New World Order, Year Zero, which started with these riots and which has now spread all across the West, and even now it's going into South America too. It's never going to stop. It is not going to be appeased until everything is reduced onto the same playing field. Because when everything is reduced onto the same playing field, it's much easier to whack off everybody's heads. The British monarchy, it can't be a source of continuity with the past. It can't be an institution of history, of order, of inspiration, of societal glue and culture, as it always has been, especially since 1689 and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Parliament really got the upper hand in between who was actually going to rule. That can't happen anymore. The British monarchy is just another institution, as racist, as bigoted, as prejudiced as anything else. Never mind its history, never mind the people who have belonged to it, because Newman actually does that too. She mentions that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, her husband, were the ones who actually helped abolish slavery in most of the civilized world. But at the end of the day, they're still racists, they're still white supremacists, they still created a system that was based on pigmentocracy and the superiority of white European people. So even when they do good things, because you are part of a particular institution, you're damned. You're damned forever. That's what the goal is, to take every single thing about the West, every single institution in every single Western country, and to pulverize it to dust. And to bring up just one more point, if that's not bad enough, that should terrify all of us. But if that wasn't bad enough, it is incredibly ironic that this has happened, because another message of the left for the longest time has been multiculturalism. We need to accept all cultures, no matter what they are, no matter how they do things, because one culture isn't better than another. Well, now we see where multiculturalism leads. It leads to monoculturalism, because now all of these different countries, South America, Britain, France, Ireland, Germany, Australia, doesn't matter what country they are, doesn't matter what their cultures are, doesn't matter what their history is, doesn't even matter what their history of racial relations are. They are all being judged by American standards, by the standards of the American progressive ideological elite. And they are demanding that all of these countries' heritage, their history, their culture, their way of life, their way of doing things be completely eradicated and thrown onto the fire, along with Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, Father Damien, the Apostle of the Lepers, Junipero Serra, and all the rest of them. That is what they want. The end goal is control. It is control not just over a city, a state, not even just over the United States. It is control of the West completely. Totally and completely. That is story number 2.